Hi everyone, and welcome to the first episode of Techifi Talks, the vlog series where I talk to someone within the software engineering sector about their career today, and also get their views on the industry in general. Delighted to say that the first guest is James Wright. James is a software engineer based in Manchester, focusing on JavaScript technologies, and also he is the co-organiser of Manchester Web Meetup. James, how are you?
Very good, thank you. Thanks for having me. How are you doing?
Yeah, very well, thank you. Very well. How's the past couple of months been for yourself?
Very interesting, to say the least. Despite the fact my life hasn't changed too much, and fortunately it hasn't impacted my work too greatly. It's been a very interesting setting for sure, seeing like the restrictions on our freedoms and the pandemic unfold in general, and then things easing, and then potential second spikes. It's an absolutely crazy situation, but I think I've come out of it fairly well, so I'm grateful for that, really.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. If anybody is actually watching this in the future, and we are sort of, well, we're kind of out of it now, but so the coronavirus has just happened basically, or we're in the midst of it anyway. If anybody gets confused why I'm asking how he's been for the past 3 months, he's not had an operation or anything like that.
Nothing serious.
Yeah. So cool. Yeah, no, like I say, thank you for being the first one on. It is much appreciated. Hopefully it will be a weekly thing as well. So I mean, obviously I mentioned there about Manchester Web Meetup. Just tell us a bit about Manchester Web Meetup, and sort of who it's aimed at, and kind of what the format is really.
Sure. So it's open to anyone, really. It's effectively a community of passionate software engineers, or those who may be passionate or want to step into web development and software engineering related to the web stack in general. We're open to absolutely anyone. So even recruiters with a technical background, or are looking to bolster their technical background, perhaps I should say, we're open to anyone as long as you have some sort of interest in web tech. The format is typically talk orientated, and we have 2 to 3 of those every session, and they're bi-monthly as well, by which I mean they take place once every 2 months. So if I recall correctly, our next one's due to take place on Wednesday, the 23rd of September, but I'll be announcing that at some point next month.
Mm-hmm. Cool, fantastic. And where's the best place for people to keep in sort of keep up to date with it? Is it on Twitter? Is that where you put your main stuff on?
We're on Twitter, but the event announcements will always land on our meetup page first. So you can go to meetup.com/Manchester-Web-Meetup, or alternatively, if you just Google Manchester Web Meetup, our meetup.com page, I think, is on the first page of the Google results.
Mm-hmm. Cool, fantastic. Open invitation to recruiters as well. Flipping at, you're brave.
Yeah, I think it's important. I think like a lot of the recruiters who do attend are actually reasonable about participating. Like if we have had times where recruiters have tried to actively muster up business, approach the attendees about a new role, and that's extremely annoying for them, and I have had to step in and tell them, look, that's not acceptable conduct effectively. But the ones who do usually attend are very respectful. They're just looking to improve their own understanding of like web technologies, JavaScript, TypeScript, Node, React, whatever falls under that umbrella, really. Most of them have been very respectful, so I'd rather not tar them all with the same brush like a lot of the community does, and allow them to attend, and the individuals who happen to be, well, idiots about it, like I'd rather just deal with them individually.
Yeah. To be fair, it's how I sort of, I mean, when I first started in software development recruitment, I went to a few meetups to start off with, and it was just purely to learn, really. And I found them really, really useful. And, if you go into them with that kind of mindset, you will improve, obviously if you're focused within software development recruitment. So I definitely recommend it, definitely. But yeah, so what made you want to start the meetup? Was it just to kind of give something back, and sort of share knowledge, and I suppose improve yourself, but also I suppose the Northwest community really?
Effectively, yeah, it was a means of bolstering the tech community in Manchester specifically, but I guess the greater Northwest, especially now that the event's remote as a result of the pandemic, and also that I live in Lancashire and not Manchester itself. So yeah, that is always interesting. But yeah, really, it was just to bolster the community there. So there were already some great meetups. I was actually working with my previous employer at the time to establish a meetup. So to be completely transparent, there was a commercial aspect to it as well. But one thing they did brilliantly, or at least with their last marketing manager, was their meetups. So they always had this format of 2 to 3 speakers each event, a theme where possible. And the meetups in Manchester were brilliant, but they were either more discussion groups, or you'd probably just have the one talk at a time. So I thought that was quite unique, having multiple speakers in the night. And that was a big motivation to bring that format up north as well. So it wasn't to kind of bulldoze the existing communities. That's not what, that isn't what community is about. But it was to provide another alternative with this slightly different format and just strengthen the community that was already there. So it was quite the passion project as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's where some meetups potentially fall down, because if you say just got a very kind of specific agenda, really, I suppose it can get a bit repetitive, and then also as well, you do run out of things to talk about, and you run out of topics, really, don't you? But if, like you say, it's called Manchester Web Meetup, the web's massive, kind of thing. So you can get a lot more different content, and I mean, I suppose as well, everybody's always got an opinion on something, haven't they, as well? So it's
precisely
good to get a different variety. Cool, good. So obviously we want to talk about I suppose your experiences as an engineer as well. So I mean, going back, I suppose right to the start, really, sort of what made you, I mean, when did you decide that you wanted to be a software engineer? Was there a point in time where you thought, yeah, I'm really going to go for this?
Well, I've known probably most of my life that I wanted to work in computers in some capacity. So my parents always put me in front of computers. So I think I was first exposed to one when I was age 3. And it was effectively an Amiga 1200 in somewhat different casing. It was some branding thing. But obviously, I was 3 years old, so I couldn't really do anything with it at the time. Usually, my mum just put like a CD-ROM in and left me to it. But I was hooked since, like, on games consoles. We got the first Windows PC for the family when I was about 7. And like being able to play 3D games and just do all sorts on it. I just always love how you had this machine that was generalized, and it just had all these like capabilities in it, say for multimedia, word processing of the bits and pieces. So I always knew programming was a thing, but I think I grew up in this really interesting time between the microcomputer revolution, where you had these well-known mass-produced computers like, say, the Commodore 64, the ZX Spectrum, that had like well-defined programming languages, like usually some basic interpreter. So there were all sorts of books out there and magazines, and you could just code along and learn that way. And then the later generation, where now we're seeing like computer science being reintroduced into schools, the BBC microcomputer coming back, Raspberry Pis. Now it's kind of in this middle situation where Windows was prevalent, but there wasn't really an educational coding environment for children. So I never really picked up code. What happened with me instead was I started with HTML when I was 13. So I found a book in my school library. I think HTML4 was the standard at that point, but the book I found was HTML 3.2, but I was like, whatever, I don't know any different, this will do. So I started making websites, and at that point, I think I realized the capability of like the web and just being able to freely publish pages of whatever content you wanted. and host it somewhere. So I was building and hosting websites in my teens. As I got a bit older, I did learn a little bit of CSS, a tiny bit of PHP. Remember cut and paste JavaScript code for your website when that was a thing as well.
You weren't a cut and paste dev, were you? Flipping heck.
I was. I was in my roots, I'm sad to say, yeah. But yeah, I'd say I really got into software engineering when I went to university to do computer science and French, funnily enough, odd combo, I know, where I was taught Java. And once I kind of got my head around what statements were, what control flow was at a basic level, to be productive with programming, I was just hooked completely. And I realized, well, the possibilities are endless. If I have an idea, I can just build something with, like, what was Java at the time. So I can take an idea, and Java has such a wide and well-supported base library, I can just build whatever I want. And from there, it just rocketed. So I taught myself other languages like C#, PHP, JavaScript, even a little bit of C++. And the one final thing that solidified for me that I wanted to get into tech was because I did French as well. I taught on my year abroad, and I enjoyed it to an extent, but I was coding in my spare time when I was in France, and I only worked 14 hours a week, so I had plenty of time to practice. And that really just made the idea of me wanting to go into tech concrete, and it just solidified my passion, and I knew it's what I had to do once I graduated uni.
Yeah. Coming on to university then, I mean, because there's a real sort of, I suppose, discussion point around that. Sort of, I know when particularly I started in recruitment, it was sort of quite frustrating in the sense that the university syllabus for computer science or the software engineering degrees, the syllabus was only allowed to change something like every 5 years, and to me that just sounded sort of ridiculous, because you can be out of date in like 6 months. So it was to me that just absolutely shocked me. So I wanted to sort of see from your point. So obviously you went to Chester Uni, didn't you? And
I did.
Yeah. Did university from a learning point of view, not necessarily a drinking point of view, but did it set you up how you wanted, or how you felt it would go to enable you to go out and get your first job?
It did, in the sense that it exposed me to actually proper formal computer programming and actually building software. I think it's a bit of a misnomer in terms of what I actually studied. So computer science would suggest to me the more theoretical aspects. So say data structures, algorithms, different, like you could go as far as like network topologies, for example, real theoretical meaty stuff. And that to me is computer science, and I think that's always going to be applicable until like key paradigms change or new ones are introduced, things like kind of blockchain, or rather distributed ledger databases, as a really contrived example. But what I did really, it was more, well, it wasn't even software engineering, I'd say. So you have like computer science degrees, and now you have software engineering degrees where universities are trying to teach you more practical programming, design patterns, unit testing, version control like Git. And I think that's the better approach. And the best universities, as you said, there's an issue where a lot of them don't update the syllabus except for once every 5 years, and it just goes extremely stale. The best universities will update it regularly. I mean, it says a lot, even in the computer science world, where MIT, was it MIT or Harvard? It's one of those unis released an alternative to their CS50 fundamental programming course, where it was JavaScript as the language. So that says a lot about how universities are trying to catch up. But in terms of how well it prepared me, I think it taught me some fundamental paradigms about building software and some high-level best practices. But I'd say in terms of practical software engineering, I learnt a lot more on the 4-week bootcamp on my grad scheme at Sky that was applicable to my role than I did in the 4 years of my degree.
Yeah, it's funny that you should say that really as well, because I mean, I was going to ask as well, obviously. So if you were sort of just coming out of college, say, and thinking about, right, do I go to university or do I mean, now you can get software development apprenticeships now, can't you? Or like there's coding academies and you know, different things like that. I mean, what would you sort of recommend now to any sort of budding engineer if they're at, say, they're you know, like I say, just at like 18 years old and they're debating what to do?
I think generally, if you know you want to get into software engineering, I'd say foremost, it's not mandatory to go to university. Even the theoretical concepts, I think if you're able to understand how to code and follow design patterns and then use data structures in your code, you can probably pick up some of the theory as well. So foremost, I'd say you don't have to go to university. I'll reframe it a little bit, actually. I think personally for me, if I were 18, not to disparage the coding boot camps, I work with some graduates of a coding boot camp in my current job, and they're absolutely outstanding. Like, they're better than half the devs I've worked with in like the prior 8 years of my career.
If you work with games, then so some of you might know who you are then with that.
Yeah, they'll know. If they're watching this, they'll know who they are. Bootcamp graduates in my current job, it narrows it down to like 2 people. But I think for me personally, I would go for the apprenticeship route at 18. So with the I guess there is the upfront cost of the boot camps. I'm not sure how the funding works with the apprenticeship, but I know with the boot camp, you will have to pay the cost up front at certain coding schools, boot camps, excuse me. And I think as well, where you potentially run the risk with those as well is I know some of them, they have this cycle of their graduates then immediately teaching the next cohorts without having any industry experience, and I completely disagree with that. Whereas I think with a proper apprenticeship, at least you'll be taught by proper tutors, and then you'll rotate that with actual placements and then back into education and back and forth. And then that will happen, that'll last over a couple of years. So it's not just some intense thing where you have loads of stuff thrown at you at high levels, you can go in a company. I think it's a bit more structured than that. So to me, that would make an apprenticeship preferable. So you don't have to go to uni. And if you decide you don't want to, then I'd lean towards the apprenticeship if I were 18.
Yeah, I think to me that makes sense really as well. I mean, I would recommend, you know, the apprenticeship route really as well, because you do get the best of both worlds really, don't you? You get the sort of on the ground floor, you know, experience of, you know, potentially working within a live environment, but then also you've got the learning aspects of as well, where you can really sort of play around and practice. Whereas, you know, like say, if you are in a live environment, you've got to be careful, haven't you, kind of thing. Yeah. So yeah, and you mentioned obviously there after graduating, you got your first role at Sky then as well. Yeah. What was that like? Because obviously, you know, Sky, huge company as well. Were you kind of at that time thrown into the deep end, or were you sort of a bit like an apprenticeship, kind of sort of guided in terms of practice and then work on a live environment? How did it sort of work then for you?
It was actually a middle ground between the two, to give you the non-straightforward answer. Right. So we had a 4-week boot camp in which we covered Java, test-driven development and unit testing in general, the different types of testing like integration, end-to-end, soft skills, agile predominantly as well. So it's worth noting that the people on my grad scheme had degrees, but they weren't always in software engineering or computer science. So there were geography and biochem graduates, for example, who'd just done computer programming as part of their course or in the spare time, and they just really got into it. So they wanted to pursue it as a career. So we covered a lot from scratch. And to be fair, that was good for me, because I don't want to disparage my my former university, because look, I did look back at their syllabus recently, and it looks like they are covering a lot of good stuff now. But at the time, I think it had only been a self-accrediting university for about 3 years. So the computer science side of my degree was incredibly hit and miss. So that's why I learned so much more in those 4 weeks than I did on the 3 years in my degree. In terms of then going into projects, the reason why I said it was kind of in between was we didn't really have any assisted or classroom-based learning after that 4 weeks. It was straight onto projects. However, they were internal projects, or those that weren't critical and customer facing. So at least if things went wrong, if we broke a deployment, it wouldn't actually impact customers. So we built educational but useful projects such as this. It's called an information radiator. So it's just a dashboard with draggable and configurable widgets that all of the Scrum teams could use to fuel their stand-ups and just to provide an overview of everything. And that was quite popular across the business, actually. Like, loads of teams used that. But we were working on those caliber of internal but useful projects, and nothing customer facing. That lasted about 7 months. And then I got put onto, and that was with JavaScript and a bit of Ruby on Rails. So I had like some familiarity with the tech stack. And then I got thrown onto the Xbox 360 app team for Now TV. And that was C# and Silverlight. So I knew a bit of C#, knew nothing about Silverlight, except it was that horrible, unreliable browser plugin for rich media applications. So it's rich internet applications, to be technically specific. So that was a huge learning curve. I kind of had to, they were very supportive, the team. Like, I'm still friends with most of them now, and like the engineers were brilliant mentors to whom I owe a great deal of my career. But ultimately, I still had to hit the ground running, get my C# up to scratch, learn the APIs, get used to all the development toolchain and the like. That went really well, actually. And then I reached a point where I think I kind of adopted almost like the software engineering mindset of being open to new technologies and approaches, to take criticism constructively, to actually improve my software and my understanding. And I found as I gained more experience and applied that mindset more, I was able just to pick things up a lot more easily anyway. So then I decided to jump back into JavaScript and joined the Sky News web team. And there was a lot of new stuff there. So I hadn't really done much responsive web design before. So CSS media queries, actually applying. So it's all like vanilla JavaScript and jQuery, but applying actual design patterns to make client-side code unit testable before React was really in wide use. So yeah, I just kept my mind open. And again, that was hitting the ground running, but it wasn't too stressful. And by having that open mind, I was just able to learn a lot. So my experience at Sky was great, really. Generally, lots of getting up to speed, but it was very supportive and they did treat people very well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you think that helps you going into a much larger business, sort of once you graduated, in the fact that you were allowed to have that sort of kind of a 7-month bedding in period, really, weren't you, until you went on to the sort of customer facing environment? Whereas if you were to join a much smaller business, and this isn't to say don't join smaller businesses once you've graduated, but did that kind of really help you, giving you that kind of 7-month buffer, really?
Yeah, I think so, definitely. Just allowed me to kind of dip my toes in. Sure, I had the, some pressures of delivery, having, teams still needed us to fix bugs because they might have been critical and blocking them, but knowing that it wasn't something that would impact Sky's customers directly and damage the reputation, that took a lot of pressure away. And then really, like, we were quite open with some of the business requirements, so we were able to kind of just experiment and learn and take our time, and that really helped. I think if I had to go into a commercial team like Now TV straight away, I'm not sure I would have failed per se, but it would have been much more of a struggle. So I think at a smaller company, you'd probably be more expected to hit the ground running, like in a commercially, like, customer facing context. I think that's a given. So yeah, perhaps a bigger company can, and it doesn't have to be a giant, like maybe 40,000 person company like Sky. It can be a lot smaller than that. I think the key thing is if you can find a company who have opportunities for mentorship of junior engineers and allow you to actually experiment and fail in a non-critical way, I think that's going to be key to your development and how quickly you grow as an engineer as well.
Yeah, I think that's massively important, for someone who is just graduated, or looking at their sort of first role. Really, is that if you take into account everything, don't just focus on, oh great, I need to get a job, so I'll take the first thing that comes, because if you just take anything and it's the wrong business, it can have a detrimental effect. You do see people going out of the industry because they didn't like it, because that first kind of experience for them wasn't the best. So I think probably the best advice from what you've said there for me is if you do go to a smaller business, maybe if you went to a business that is a couple of hundred people, for example, just make sure that you realize that you will kind of have more responsibility early on, rather than if you went to a Sky, for example, that have a huge graduate program, and you have that kind of buffer. So I think they're massive sort of takeaways from that, really. So yeah, so moving forward in your career, obviously left Sky as well. How's your skill set had to adapt sort of over the years, from sort of when you started up until now? I mean, did you adapt because you had an interest in particular technologies, or did you adapt because of you saw the way in which the market was going in terms of business, in terms of a technology becoming more popular with businesses and employers?
It was a bit of both, definitely. So being on the C# driven Xbox 360 app for Now TV, I noticed more teams were using JavaScript around that time, especially when Node.js I think Node.js had maybe been around in its production form for maybe about 4 or 5 years at that point, and it was really gaining steam. A lot of engineers could see the potential in writing the server-side language and the the server and the client in the same language, and the same JavaScript runtime, V8. And I realized the potential of that technology, and the demand for it was just ramping up exponentially. But then also, I have always enjoyed writing JavaScript, even if versions prior to ES6 or ES 2015 were quite rough around the edges, and you had the verbose nature of prototypal inheritance versus the class type syntactic sugar you have now. I have always enjoyed writing in JavaScript and writing asynchronous client-based web applications. So it was a bit of both, to be honest with you. In terms of my tech stack adapting over time, so for example, learning things like React, I was very skeptical of React when I first saw it, because seeing effectively an XML or effectively seeing markup within JavaScript files, so returning React element trees with JSX, I thought, why is there XML in my JavaScript? That seems like a horrible idea. But of course, I practiced it, and I came to realize, actually, this abstracts all of the stuff I was having to do with the query selector API or jQuery, where you're having to target nodes in your DOM tree and then update the properties imperatively. The beauty of React is you just have this tree of React elements, you specify properties, and React will just know what to update under the hood based on those properties. And I think that's just, it's just so nice. It's like I would never go back to just like manually hand coding DOM code ever again. So I have like adapted quite a bit in that respect. Also, I'd say in terms of paradigms on the front end, so React has really kind of leveraged, and especially Redux has leveraged functional programming, like the concept of reducers, function-based components. So you have like pure functions of an element tree that's an output of a function that takes props as input. It has been quite interesting on a side note to see that occur. So coming from my background in JavaScript prior to having commercial experience, where no one would really unit test anything, no one would follow any patterns, you just have these like small scripts that would complement the markup you were sending down from the server. I mean, that was always the purpose of JavaScript. Seeing it grow into this fully formed software engineering ecosystem that supports testing, best practices, you know, static typing with TypeScript as well. That's been interesting, and I've adapted to follow all of that because I think it's highly beneficial. So really a lot of the practices I did pick up from C# and elsewhere were applicable at a high level, but yeah, definitely in JavaScript terms, I've had to adapt a lot over the last 10 years or so.
Yeah, because obviously with JavaScript, there seems to be a different sort of framework, or the different libraries coming out every single week at the minute. Do you think that's a good thing, or do you think it's a bit overkill?
I think it's a good thing generally because it allows us as a community to explore alternative ideas to those that are the most popular. So, for example, Svelte is a component-based framework, sort of like React, except it's called the disappearing framework. And what they effectively mean by that is, rather than something like React, where all JSX does is it just, if you're using Babel or TypeScript, it's just transpiled to React.create element function calls. You're still having to embed a library into your application, into your JavaScript bundle that contains React and does all the updates. What Svelte does is it, when it builds your components in your code, there's no library. All it does is it replaces your components and your DOM functionality with actual pure DOM code, actual DOM API calls with like query selector and the like, as if you'd written that code by hand. So rather than React, where it's a library and at runtime it does things, Svelte, it just outputs the exact DOM operations you need in your JavaScript to perform those UI updates. So that's something that I think is going to become more prevalent going forward, maybe even with WebAssembly. I think that idea is very powerful, and it's turned a few heads, to say the least. So although I think a lot of frameworks, especially in JavaScript, can be driven on ego and people just wanting to build like the next React just to satiate like their own self-esteem, as brutal as I think that sounds. And I think by having like this open source community and libraries being released every week, it puts new ideas into circulation. And you've got to think that not a lot of these ideas were original. I think React was, so I can't remember the name of the exact technology, but JSX, there were two things. There was something in ECMAScript 4, a now cancelled JavaScript specification from maybe about 10 years ago, that had something called E4X, and that was XML within JavaScript like React. It was more for, I think, data manipulation, but I think that had an influence. And there was something similar in PHP. So PHP has a feature, I can't remember the name because it's not my speciality really, but PHP had a feature for building UI components that was XML based, and then you'd effectively output HTML for those components. So it was like a similar level of abstraction to React. So, and if you look at Redux as well, the concept of a reducer, that's a functional programming paradigm that's been around since the 1970s. So my point is, everything has an influence on everything else. There are hardly any original ideas in software engineering these days. And by having all of these libraries and frameworks coming out at a constant rate, it's bonkers when you think about it. It's at least getting ideas into circulation that then perhaps more popular libraries or bigger and better libraries can then adopt and bring into their own functionality, or perhaps in terms of how they're written under the hood. So I think it's a good thing mostly.
Yeah. I think obviously as well, I think everything has to have a purpose as well, doesn't it? You can't just bring something out for the sake of it, kind of thing, really. I think as long as it's got a purpose and it's going to improve something or make something easier or whatever that may be, there is a market there for it, isn't there, really? But yeah, no, cool. I suppose just going on now to, I suppose, the industry in general, really. I mean, has the perception of software engineers sort of changed since you kind of started? Because I mean, I know when I started in recruitment, it was the perception of software engineers, obviously, oh, they're just geeks. They stick them in a separate room with the headphones on, nobody talks to them, kind of thing. But I think, in my view, obviously having seen it develop over time, I mean, software engineering is cool now. People want to do it, from all backgrounds, really, as well. Have you seen the sort of perception change, yourself since you started?
I have, definitely, but I'm admittedly quite cynical, and I think a big part of the reason for that is because businesses have seen the value in digital transformation and undertaking software engineering projects as if they were tech companies. So now they need us techies more than ever, and it's like, oh yeah, you're cool now, putting their arm around you and trying to coach you in. But I do agree as well. I think a lot more people are taking an interest in it, and they, it's not just the earning potential. I think people are actually seeing the potential that's unlocked by software engineering and effectively being able to manipulate computers with abstract languages that describe instructions and imperative control flow. I think a lot more people are seeing value in that, absolutely. So I think that's only making it more accessible. Well, actually, I think that's making it maybe more trendy, but then also it is more accessible as a side effect. So I think the people I know outside of tech, they still associate it with like being a bit of a geek for sure. It's like, it's an intense interest, and I think if you're that passionate about it, even if you're not programming in your own time, because that's not mandatory, I think the people who still do best are those who are like most passionate and deeply interested in it. So they are seen as geeky sometimes. So I think there's more of an acceptance, and maybe popular culture has made it less geeky, but I don't think everyone sees it as like this cool and hip activity now. Maybe in another like 5 or 10 years.
No, do you know the biggest thing for me, and I suppose maybe one of the biggest examples of it is the fintech industry, because like I say, when I started in recruitment sort of like 10 years ago, I mean, financial services businesses, they might have had a 2-man help desk, for example, but now they've got a team of engineers. They're looking at ways that they can automate stuff, and that particular industry now has just skyrocketed, really, hasn't it? Compared to what it was, 10 years ago, or maybe even sooner. Businesses like law firms, they wouldn't have dreamed of having a software developer in there. It's like,
right.
What do we need a software developer for? But now they've got teams, and they've got architects and this and that, haven't they? It is just mental, really.
It's kind of necessary as well. If you look at, I think my favorite example always is Toys R Us. Like a global, or at least in the West, it was a Western household name in like retail, and their CEO was openly skeptical of the internet and didn't think it would take off. And then lo and behold, it did, and Toys R Us just didn't really adopt any kind of digital capability in the end, and naturally they bit the dust. So yeah, absolutely, like that story, it is just necessary.
It's like that story of Blockbuster didn't want to buy Netflix. isn't it?
Yeah, that's unbelievable. When you think of it now, and you think of them now as like the biggest like streaming like content provider in the world, it's just baffling how, like you can't be complacent in your economic position at all. If there's an upcoming technology that might seem radical at the time, but it has real value and it can evidently make people's lives better, or at least it makes a certain activity easier and more accessible, then you can't afford to be complacent. And I think a lot of businesses have realized, well, yeah, we definitely can't be. So as you said, that's why you're now seeing law firms with like architects and software engineers.
Yeah, exactly. Still baffles me to this day, how the CTO or senior people at Blockbuster didn't think, oh, let's just get a rental service online or something like that. How they didn't see that?
I know.
It's just beyond me. It's like who was running that really? But yeah, I know. And I suppose just going on, sticking about the industry, and I suppose being a software engineer in this sort of day and age, do you think it's important to like really kind of specialize in something, or do you think now you need to be good at a number of different things to be able to get by? Like, 'cause say for example, this is a really bad example, but a football team, if you want a goalkeeper, you look for a goalkeeper. If you're looking for a JavaScript engineer, you look at someone who is a JavaScript engineer. Or do you feel like you can be good at multiple different languages to get you by? Say for example, if you do a bit of JavaScript, you might do a bit of C#, you've done a bit of Java in the past, and say for example, if you then went to an interview for one of those technologies, but you're just good at it and haven't really specialized in it, do you think that is a good thing or a bad thing?
I would say generally you should specialize in one or two things, definitely. I think it's important to have like a broader picture of the whole stack, especially in a smaller company or in a startup. So for example, at the moment, I'm doing things with AWS, so a lot of cloud formation. I've started touching databases again, so I'm writing a lot more SQL than I have in any other previous role. So and it makes you more productive as well, because you don't have to go to another team to ask them to do an update that you're capable of doing yourself. So it allows you just to focus on your features as opposed to focusing on like service teams, and I think that is more efficient. However, the problem is if you know everything at a surface level, you've got an overall picture, great, and you probably make a good architect, to be honest. But if you had to take responsibility for a certain application or a certain feature, and it was heavily dependent upon this one area of expertise, but you just have like a surface overview of everything, then perhaps you're going to hit roadblocks quickly, and you're going to need a lot of help from other developers who are more specialized. So for me personally, I would absolutely specialize in one or two things. So I think my specialty is personally mainly in JavaScript, right? So JavaScript, TypeScript, Node, React, anything in the JS space is my specialty, and I know all of that stuff deeply. But then I also have like a relatively reasonable understanding of databases. Yeah, I couldn't architect stuff maybe in the most optimal way, but I can define relationships, build queries for fetching and aggregating data from related tables. I could build, for example, resources for AWS. I could spin up databases, maybe some EKS cluster, for example, with cloud formation. Not my speciality, and I might do it in a bit of a verbose and a roundabout way, but I know the high level best practices of doing that. So I think ultimately, have depth definitely in a small handful of areas, but if you have proficiency at some sort of high level with a few other things as well across as much of the engineering stack as possible, I think that's the best balance for being productive and having a certain set of deep expertise.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Yeah, no, I think, like you said, I mean, in this day and age now, it's a case of you can't, well, I suppose you can be, but, you know, if you're, say, for example, just a C# developer, you know, you maybe need a little bit more nowadays, don't you? You know, kind of thing. You need to be a lot more full stack, unless obviously you're a front end developer, you know, kind of thing. But you need to have that sort of all-rounded knowledge, really, don't you?
Yeah, and I mean, yeah, exactly. And the thing is as well, different technologies solve different problems better. So, for example, if I were doing something incredibly CPU bound, maybe I consider Go instead of Node, although you do have things like serverless architectures, I guess, but maybe that's a different kettle of fish. But so not every technology is targeted to every problem, even if it is, say for C#, for example, that's quite a general purpose language. And if you were building a web front end, obviously JavaScript's the way to go if you're not using WebAssembly, right? So different technologies have different purposes. And I think if you have a high level understanding of that and like the best practices at a high level as well, it won't take you long to be productive. So another example is I'm using a lot of Go in this role as well. And for example, like I know what pointers are and dereferencing and that sort of thing. But then, for example, one small thing I learned the other day in a code review, type aliases and type declarations, I think they're called. They're slightly different and nuanced, even though they're just a couple of characters in difference. So whereas I might have known that if I had a super deep understanding of Go, I at least have enough understanding of it at a somewhat higher level to be productive with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And one of the sort of big talking points at the moment, you know, particularly amongst, I'd say, software engineers and also recruiters as well, really, is tech tests at interviews. What's your view on them? Love them, hate them, think they've got a place in certain scenarios, or?
I don't mind them, I think is my answer. And also, I don't completely hate them either. So it depends what they're asking you to do. If they're giving you 2 days and they're asking you to build an entire feature of an e-commerce website, so it's like, oh, we want you to build a shopping cart API that's connected to a database. We want you to build a front end for it, and it needs to have all these tests in place, and like you need to handle all these edge cases. That's just ridiculous, because you can assess that sort of thing from the past projects on which ones worked, and also things like GitHub, if they do have it. There are other ways of ascertaining that. But I think having some small really self-contained challenge is probably like the good middle ground. I know some people, are adamantly against tech tests, and I think while not everyone has the time to prepare and put all their effort into them, I think to an extent they're necessary, because they do give you a high level understanding of someone's problem solving ability, how they work with you, how they communicate with you, and their logical ability as well, and of course their expertise in the given language. So I think my last company actually did that best. So rather than have you building like full end-to-end projects, they'd give you small algorithmic challenges. And I don't mean like the cruel kind of algorithmic challenge, like build a self-balancing red-black binary tree or anything like that. It was more like, here's a JavaScript object that's deeply nested. How do you flatten it into a single level of properties, or build a class that lazily evaluates functions? So they give you a small exercise just in plain JavaScript, and it would probably take anywhere from 30 to 60 minutes to do. So I think tech tests are beneficial, and they give you a good overview of how someone works. But I think if you're going above 2 hours for the ideal time it takes for a test to complete, I think that's too far. So actually, to wrap up on that, I did have a coding interview a while back at one company, and it was a hard 2 hours. So I thought, that's fine. Yeah, it's not going to be too complicated. And they wanted me to build a full-end single-page application in that time, with routing, API calls, styling as well. Like they expected it to be design as if it were like a production grade UI. And when you have to pull in all the dependencies and architect everything, and with unit tests as well, in a fixed 2 hours, that's too much. So I think the best ones, limit them to 2 hours, but make it a smaller self-contained exercise that assesses ability and understanding of a particular technology without having to build a fully blown feature set.
Yeah, I think the best one, or just say the most effective ones that I've seen, are the ones where you do like a paired programming code kata, where you literally do it as part of the interview, and it's literally half an hour. So, you know, how you bounce
it's
ideas.
A kata, precisely.
Yeah. How you bounce ideas off each other, you know, like you said, what's your problem solving like, you know, that kind of thing. And I think any person who knows software engineering should be able to tell if anybody's any good after half an hour of working with them, really. So yeah, cool. And sort of a final question really from me is sort of, what would the James of today sort of tell the James who recently graduated?
It would be, you're on the right track, keep doing what you're doing. As cheesy as that sounds, it almost sounds like it's from some kind of 80s film. But ultimately, like, I think the key things that have helped me be successful are, I'm passionate about what I do. Like, it wasn't just the earning potential. I'm really passionate about software engineering and computing in general, and I just love solving problems and building with code. Like, I've always tried to have an open mind towards new approaches and technologies, and I'd always practice as well. And I'd have, like, I still do today actually, like, I'm still building open source software and experimenting with new technologies in my own time. So I think I would have said to myself, knowing I had all those characteristics from when I graduated, even when I was in my last year and doing my dissertation and everything else, I was still building my own projects. I'd say to myself, absolutely, just keep doing what you're doing, keep practicing, and keep being passionate about it.
Mm-hmm. Definitely fantastic. Yeah, I mean, if you're passionate about something, you'll never work a day in your life, will you? Really,
exactly.
You know, kind of thing, because you're enjoying what you're doing day in, day out. So,
that came to mind.
One of the big things that I would always say to someone, you know, particularly in this day and age now, and with how universities are, I mean, I would always say only go to university if you have to get a degree for the career that you want. So, you know, like software engineering, you know, you don't have to go to university, but it is beneficial. But things, you know, like a doctor or a vet, or, you know, something in financial services or something like that, it does wind me up when people go to university, do a load of theologies, and then just have a piss up for 4 years, you know, kind of thing.
Yeah, it's like, basically.
And then those people end up in recruitment, you know, kind of thing, because they haven't got anything to go into.
You're talking from experience.
No, do you know what? I didn't actually go to university. I'm not clever enough. Not clever enough. I'm not.
Well, you got where you needed to be, and you saved a load of money and time. So you know, it's not that bad, is it?
Exactly. As my mother always said, should do better. But yeah, no, James, I really appreciate you obviously coming on and being the first guest on the.
Thanks for having me
on the vlog. If people want to sort of reach out to you to ask you any questions, LinkedIn and Twitter, the best places to contact you.
Sure. So I'm on LinkedIn, Twitter. My handle's James Sean Wright. So that's all one word, and Sean is spelt S-E-A-N. So James S-E-A-N Wright. You can find me there on Twitter.
Yeah, cool. I'll put all of James's links to his social media in the description as well. I'll put any information as well that I can get to Manchester Web Meetup as well. So
thank you.
Is the best sort of link? Is that the Meetup page? Is that the best one to put in there?
Yeah, on meetup.com. Yeah, definitely, that's the best one.
Yeah, fantastic, great stuff. Well, thank you everybody for watching. Hopefully there is people that watch this. Like I say, it is the first one that we're doing, but this is going to be a weekly series, talking to different people within the software engineering industry. You know, we've got some fantastic people lined up to speak over the next couple of weeks. Like I say, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, leave any comments as well. If you leave any comments, I'll try and direct them to James to see if he can answer. And thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all again soon.